I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello, and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Ben Austen to the show. Ben is a journalist from Chicago and the author of Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change, named one of the best books of 2023 by the Washington Post. It was also a New York Times editor's pick. His previous book, High Risers, Cabrini Green and the Fate of American Public Housing, was longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal of Excellence in Nonfiction and named one of the best books of 2018 by a whole host of media outlets. A former editor at Harper's Magazine, Ben teaches in the creative writing program at the University of Chicago. His feature writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, GQ, Wired, and many other publications. Today we'll be talking with Ben about his most recent book, Correction, The Broken System of Parole, and what second chances really looks like. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Hey, Jessica, it's an honor to be here.
And let's just get started because I am so excited to talk with you about this excellent book. In fact, everyone listening, I was just saying to Ben before we got started how compelling of a narrative this book really is. It's something you want to sit down and really take a read through. And I know that your path to writing this book is really an interesting one. It came about through Johnny Veal, who you feature in your book and who now goes by the name of Khalif. And what's so interesting about Correction and the story of Johnny Veal is that you sort of first met him through your first book, High Risers. Could you help us understand the connection between your first book and this current one?
Thanks so much for that question, Jessica, and for the kind words about the book. So my first book was called High Risers, and it's about a public housing complex here in Chicago called Cabrini Green. And if listeners don't know it, it was considered, in quotes, one of the most infamous places in America. And a lot of my work of sort of thinking about the place and thinking about its history was exploring that tension between myth and reality. The myth of the place as an urban center, as a place that people thought was really scary, and the reality of what life was like there and like there for residents. And so in telling that story, there was an event that I wrote about, which was a double murder that happened there in 1970, a terrible crime. Two police officers on a walk and talk community relations beat are just strolling across a baseball field, and they're killed by snipers. I wrote about it because not just the crime was awful, but it really transformed the community. It was the moment in a way that Cabrini Green became, like, in quotes, Cabrini Green, like an abstraction, an idea, and became, notorious in a way throughout not just America, but even the world. So I wrote all about this crime and its aftermath. And one of the people convicted of that crime was a 17-year-old at the time, a 17-year-old in 1970 named Johnny Veal. And I wrote about the case, I wrote about the trial, I wrote about, what happened after. I never thought to interview this person. I'm a pretty good reporter. And it just didn't cross my mind that this 17-year-old in 1970 would be sitting in a prison cell like 50 years later. So when the book came out, as you said, in 2018, so it's 48 years later, a friend of Johnny Veal's reached out to me. And he said, hey, I saw that you wrote about this crime. Johnny Veal is still sitting in prison, and he's also coming up for parole. And that's really how it got everything started.
You wrote this story in 2018 that takes a deep look back at what happened at Cabrini Green. And think about the language that they use, this idea of snipers, right? I mean, that's the term that they used for the folks who killed these two police officers. But then you've got a 17-year-old who was sort of almost incongruously arrested as one of the quote unquote snipers, right? And so you wrote all about this, but you never really did think I wonder what Johnny Veal's story actually might have been.
And Jessica, I'll say that, I'm guilty of that, but in many ways, the system creates that. The system is meant to not think about people once they're tossed out, once they're sent away. That prisons are really far away from urban centers. They're hard to contact. It's hard to visit. We're not supposed to think about these human beings who are in prisons. The span of this history is like actually my entire lifetime as well. I'm born the year this happened. This happened in 1970. I'm born the year after in 1971, so it's older than me. And it's also the history, the entire span of mass incarceration. Our country's prison system transforms in this time. I feel culpable, guilty of something, but I mean, that's the work of being an explorer and a journalist and being curious. It's like, okay, what did I miss? And now let me go back and try to figure this out.
Right. But you sort of get this email or phone call or something, and the person says to you, hey, Johnny Veal is still in prison. And they also say, maybe you want to talk to him. And kudos to you, Ben, because you did.
Yeah, and it was more than that too. So there were the other two pieces of it were Annie's coming up for parole, and I was like, parole? I wanted to think more about that. I was, piqued my curiosity, and the friend of said that Johnny Veal was innocent of the crime, and so I had to also think like, well, what does that mean? In terms of trying to uncover something from 50 years earlier. Like, how could you know? How could you find out something different? This predates when DNA evidence. And so the first thing I did at that point was I reached out to Khalif, Johnny Veal, and I wanted to talk to him and say, I'm curious about this, and let's talk, and maybe it's something I might work on. And then I also was like, well, let me start going to parole hearings and just like to see what they're like. I drove to Springfield, which is 3 hours from Chicago, 3 hours south of Chicago. The parole hearings in Illinois happen once a month on a Thursday at 9 a.m. And I went to a hearing. It was crazy powerful. I mean, this wasn't Johnny Veal's hearing, it was somebody else's. And just sitting there, a room full of like 13 ordinary citizens, trying to wrestle with this history of what happened in the past, a crime, and then trying to make this determination whether someone should go free, this monumental decision. It was all happening there. And I'd say at that point, my curiosity about parole and then meeting Khalif, meeting Johnny Veal and talking to him, that really was the genesis for the book, meaning I was like, I'm in.
And I mean, it's sort of an extraordinary thing that you did, that you thought, like, if I'm going to talk to Johnny Veal and find out about his parole hearing, I should check out a parole hearing first. And I love that it whet your interest into a subject that so few people in the United States really know about. We know about this idea of parole, but we don't really know much about it. And I want to talk so much more with you about parole. But before we do that, I just wanted to go back into your book for a minute. Your book really chronicles, if you will, the story of how Khalif, how Johnny Veal, goes through his parole process. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But you also juxtapose Johnny Veal's case with a different story, a story of a man named Michael Henderson. And I just want to raise his story and introduce the idea of his case to the folks who are listening. Now, how did his narrative differ from the lens that you were bringing to Johnny Veal's story?
Michael is somebody who was convicted of a crime in 1971 in downstate Illinois, so not in Chicago. He comes from East St. Louis, which is just on the other side of the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri. He's guilty of his crime. I mean, he was a teenager and he was, hanging out with his buddies one night in East St. Louis, and he had a gun on him and he wanted to scare another kid who was coming up to buy beer, and he shoots him. Whether the gun goes off accidentally or not, like that's unclear, but it addresses a much bigger question. I know that you do a lot of work on wrongful conviction, but this question of like, what do we do with the guilty and people who commit violent crimes is not only a much more difficult conversation to have, but in a way, the central conversation we need to have. Because the majority of people in our prison system and we lock up 1 in 4 of the world's incarcerated people, like we lock up way too many people, they've committed crimes. So, like, what do we want a punishment to do? When should it end? How long should it be? And so those kinds of questions, I didn't want to get lost just in a wrongful conviction case. And people's empathy often ends with either nonviolent offenses or with innocence. And a sense of, like, 40 something years, like, holy, I mean, 40 years, like, that is a lifetime. And so isn't that enough? Is it enough? And so I wanted the book to also wrestle with that idea of, like, what about most of the people in prison? What about most of the people? What does accountability look like? When should a long prison sentence end? This question of which is inherent in all the parole hearings, and one that we should all be wrestling with, of, like, what is the purpose of punishment? That is the question, in a way, that the book is exploring, and I think that all of us have to answer. And it's crazy that in our country we don't really have a clear answer to that.
We don't. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in doing this podcast is because I really want to think about that. I want to think about the idea of second chances and accountability. What does that look like? And you did such a great job in correction of considering one way, one small way, that we sometimes try to give people second chances through the parole system. And you're right, most of the folks in our prisons today are, in fact, guilty of some crime. But you also point out about Michael Henderson's story that he was a teenager, just like Johnny, when he committed the crime. And you talk about how we treat children who commit terrible crimes and cause terrible harm. And of course, that's a whole other subject for conversation.
During the course of reporting this book, I went to Finland and Norway to look at prisons there, and I was with a whole contingent of criminal justice folks from America and formerly incarcerated people and lawmakers. And we were in Helsinki, Finland, and there was a government official there, and he was talking about their prisons. And somebody asked, how many juveniles, how many youth do you have in prison in the country? And he was like, five, five. And we were all like, well, five what? Five what? And he was like, no, five. We have 5 kids locked up and, 5 juveniles. That seems crazy to us, but it was one of those moments where, like, we're the crazy ones.
I don't even know what word to use. We're just such outliers. We've developed a system that is so entrenched in our subconscious and our consciousness that when you say to someone, well, that person committed murder, and they're only getting, and I'm putting only in quotations, they're only getting 10 years in prison, people are like, what? Whereas in the rest of the world, that's kind of what people get, even when they commit terrible, terrible crimes. And so, one of the things that's so interesting about the United States is that we give out life sentences and life without parole sentences without a lot of thought about what that really means. And when we talk about life without parole, or even life with parole, the word parole keeps showing up. And I'm wondering if you could just start us off with this idea of parole. What's the purpose of parole? How is it used? What is it?
Yeah, parole is so logical. It makes a ton of sense. Parole is created in the United States over 100 years ago. And it's based on this idea that prisons should do more than simply punish people and warehouse them. That a purpose of prison is actually rehabilitation. So it's like, to get people ready to return to society, to free society. And so then if you take that a little bit further, you're like, okay, a judge at trial can't really know who someone is going to be or what they're going to be like in 5 years or 10 years. So how can we find out, like, when somebody is, in that time? So it's sentencing to set the firm, like, release date doesn't make as much sense as let's assign another group of people to revisit this person and talk to him and assess them in 5 or 10 years and see if they're ready. And that's the premise. It makes a lot of sense, just like in a logical way. So much so that it became the law of the land very quickly. By the early 1900s, every state and the federal system have adopted parole.
That's kind of the status quo for at least a little while, right? We've got this parole system where even though a judge will say you're sentenced to 25 years, there's an understanding that at a certain point, depending on the state or the jurisdiction, that that person who's serving a 25-year sentence will be eligible to have a different body, that parole body, to take a look and say, hey, should we allow this person an opportunity to go free with supervision? And so parole is kind of this built in release mechanism for people who earn it. So, walk me through a little bit about this history. At one point, every jurisdiction in the United States, every state, the federal government has parole, but things change quickly, right?
Yeah.
So, tell us what happens.
It sort of sticks around for a while. So much so that every prison across the country, every state changes the name of their system to a correctional institution. They're correctional systems. They're no longer prisons. These are correctional institutions. In theory, they're about rehabilitation, about correcting people. The guards are correctional officers and so on. But the system doesn't really work. First of all, inside prisons, they're not really working inside prisons to rehabilitate people. Prisons are criminogenic. They create criminal behavior rather than the opposite. So the whole way that you're supposed to judge people on how they behave in prison is kind of perverse because prisons actually demand you be your worst, not your best. And they're not providing sort of a lot of the mechanisms for people to change. Secondly, like the boards themselves don't function well. People are assigned to these boards and they're paid jobs and they look at people for a few minutes or not. There's not a lot of rules. They're not like courtrooms. They're not monitored. There's also this great feeling of racial bias in them and all kinds of other bias that, these people who are going to sit on these boards there's not a lot of oversight, make these decisions that if they just keep on saying no, someone is stuck in prison forever. They might never get out. At the same time, judges sort of like counteract, like they want to show the severity of a crime. So they start giving these sentences, which in prison, what people call Buck Rogers time, like science fiction, like I'm going to give you a 200-year sentence or like literally 1,000-year sentence. I'm giving you a 1,000-year sentence with parole, which is like, it confuses even the public about what's going on. How can someone with a 1,000-year sentence be considered for release? And then people in prison actually don't like the system. They feel like it's unfair to them. And so when there's a huge like prison rights movement in the late 60s and early 70s, one of their chief demands of people in prison is to say, let's get rid of these kinds of sentences. They're called indeterminate sentences, which are being determined by a parole board when they actually end, because they're unjust. We don't trust this system. We would rather have a fixed set of time that we know ahead of time that's fair rather than like this sort of indefinite thing where we have to trust a parole board, which we don't trust. And very quickly, like conservatives, people on the right, pick up this same attack on parole, but for a different reason. They're like, you know what, releasing anyone is kind of being soft on crime. And so parole is under attack from all sides, and it really gets curtailed in many ways. 16 states and the federal government end up eliminating parole for everybody. And only people before the law change still come up for parole, but every state really limits it. And it's sort of like part of the tough on crime movement is that people say like, this crime is no longer eligible for parole. This crime is no longer eligible for parole. Even though like, this idea of a second chance it's just part of like all our belief systems, both, religion, society, everything. And it's hard to imagine that, that doesn't exist inside prison, but for many people, it doesn't any longer. They have no chance of getting out.
Yeah. And I mean, you just talked about some of these differences in parole, right? We have some states where there just is no parole mechanism.
Yeah.
But even in the states that retains parole, in what, like 34 states that still have some form of parole, it's still really arbitrary and very opaque. I mean, who's on the parole board? Who gets to make these decisions? What's their qualifications? What's their backgrounds?
And I'll stress too that even those other 16 states still have parole boards. They're just, hearing even smaller number of cases. Either they're well before this moment or they're, special cases. Parole boards they're often picked by a governor and then approved by the state legislature in some form. It's a range of people. I mean, traditionally, and this is a big criticism of people inside prison and their advocates is that many people who are assigned to parole boards have a criminal justice background. They're prosecutors, they're former police, they're prison officials, and they often have a bias of like, I'm not thinking about a second chance. I'm thinking about like, how do I still punish that crime? That's what they've been trained to do, literally. Like they've been trained to prosecute cases, to arrest people, to police people. And so they end up often like kind of repeating the work of a trial judge, which is just revisiting the crime again and again and again and sort of, ruling on that. Like, I'm going to punish you more rather than thinking about the point of parole is everything that happens afterwards. But, like in Illinois, where I am, which also abolished parole in 1978, but still has this parole system, there are rules in place where you have an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. They come from all over this vast state. And so they often have different backgrounds and different beliefs. And sitting in a parole hearing, it can be at times really powerful to hear people with very different ideologies try to like work together to hash out a sense of justice. It can also be incredibly frustrating because you hear this thing again and again where they're not considering like who a 65-year-old is today, but they're sort of talking incessantly about what happened when that person was 19. And I mean, the amount of time that has passed since, just it's like it doesn't matter. It's like it disappears.
Right? I mean, I think that's such an important point. There's no mechanism to prove they've changed. It's as if the only thing that ever matters is the crime. And if that's true, well, then we can't really ever provide someone an honest second chance because you can't go back in time. You can't change the crime that occurred. So that's really an important point.
Yeah, that's well put. Thank you.
So, tell me a little bit about the parole process for people who are eligible for parole. What do people facing the parole board do to prepare? What narratives work? What narratives don't work?
And just to like even pause on that, to think about the stakes for someone coming up for parole. Like you can sort of speak your way to freedom. I mean, think about the how much pressure that is. You're gonna, every however many years, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, you can come up and say something that try to convince these group of people that I'm worthy for release. It's like what words equal freedom? And generally, like what works the most is like parole boards want to hear about remorse. They want to hear about, a kind of story of redemption, of change. It's hard, because parole boards, of course, are like, how do you know what's real remorse or change? Like, how can you figure that out? And it's even more problematic because you think of like, is somebody who's a better storyteller or more articulate more worthy for release than someone who's not? Very quickly you can see all the problems in like in parole right away. But it is also meaningful to like just to hear and see somebody, to see them in the present, to not be lost totally in the past. And that happens during these interviews. And states often fail to have a system in place that says like, here's what you need to do to get released. Like a good system on day one would say, listen, you did this terrible thing. Our job is to try to get you back into free society at some point. Here's the list of things we hope you achieve. And then you could sort of come before a parole board and be like, listen, I did X, Y, and Z, and I've done these things. Often prison systems don't even prepare people for their hearing. So you have kind of like this, prison house system go that people try to educate one another on the little bit of information they have of, back and forth. And there are a lot of nonprofits who do this work also to try to prepare people to be better at their hearings. And some of the things that they prepare them for are very logical, but really messed up, like make eye contact, don't try to sort of minimize the crime you did, control your body language, don't seem threatening in any way, be very honest because they have a record of what you did. And so if you hem or haw, try to change something, they're going to like, be all caught up on those details of like whatever happened in 1984, like you're sort of stuck in that moment. But that training works. And like one of the like powerful aspects of it, if, in theory, like what parole could do is that it's a moment for people to sort of grapple with not just what they did, but their own sense of like trauma, anything else that sort of, got them where they are. And this is a way where, you could, before you can tell your own story to a board, you have to kind of understand it and to think it's like therapy in a way. It is therapeutic and it could be. That could be a really powerful aspect. And there are nonprofits who do that work who are wonderful with it, of like, it's painful when people are denied, but they really, you're able to sort of understand yourself much better and sort of deal with your own demons.
I mean, I actually have a guest coming on later this season who's going to help us sort through the concept of remorse. What does remorse even mean? What are the factors that people look at? Because I think, to your point, it's really complex. And how you present remorse is really complex and not always the same across cultures and across different demographics. And so that also can be really hard. And I love that, at least in Chicago, where you are, there's some groups that are helping. I know in New York, there's some great organizations that help prepare people for parole. But I think the reality is in many states that people are on their own. And that can be really, really difficult, particularly when people who did commit a terrible crime are still grappling with the shame and the consequences of their actions. And yet, I think, to your point, that's an important part of the healing process and the moving forward process. And so you've sat through a whole bunch of parole hearings now, and they look at all these different factors and they sort of grapple with it in their own unique ways. And based on your assessment, what have you seen?
Parole, as in through this book, is just so many examples of just how subjective it can be, how just random a decision can be, which just how could this equal justice if, like, on a day a group of people are like a little bit tired, or like they've already freed two people that day and they don't want to free another one, or like they're thinking about traffic and how to get home. There's one case that I talk about where a woman who's on the board tells me this story when they're deliberating. And it's her first hearing, and one of her colleagues says she's not going to vote for release. She's just not feeling it. And the woman who tells me the story is like, well, how are you not feeling it? Like, I don't get it. Like, this person has done all this work in prison. They're like, this is an example of like somebody who's rehabilitated. And she goes, he has all this support on the outside. I mean, like, why are we wasting money even on him being here? And the woman then says, yeah, I guess you're right. I'll change my vote. That's powerful, like two people in dialogue, but also just like, what the hell? Like that's that moment of speaking up can change it. Like, how does that equal what a fair punishment is? A fair amount of time in prison. Like, it's so arbitrary. And of course, like, it's just as arbitrary on the front end of the system, in court cases and so on. There's just much more oversight of it. But there are all so many ways of like who's arrested and who's convicted. All those other things can be arbitrary. The thing that's sort of unique about parole is that it's not just the backwaters of the criminal system, but the back end. So you look and you see the entire thing. You see all that time in prison as well as what happened at trial and what happened before. It's like it's the whole record of the criminal justice system. It works still in theory, in the sense, I mean, it's still such a system that feels unjust, but it also works in the sense that it feels there has to be some mechanism of second chances. There has to be some system of second chances. And this becomes like this periodic moment when people have a chance to be seen and heard and sort of to be evaluated again. That idea needs to go on. Like, we need something. I talked about a history of mass incarceration sort of spanning the stories of both Johnny and Michael, but like when they entered prison in the 1970s, there were 200,000 people in prison everywhere across the country, every state and the federal system. And we have 200,000 people in prison today serving life or de facto life. They're going to die in prison, the same number as the entire prison system before this. And so those hundreds of thousands of people, like, we don't have that many just like monsters. We have people who are like did something horrible and now they're old men or older women, older people. And there has to be some way to like assess them, not like get out of jail free card, but like some way to say, like, who are you today? And what we really want to work on is like, how do we get you, to think about whether you come back to society, to restore your liberty. And parole in theory at least can do that.
Yeah, and that statistic is staggering. Just the way that we ballooned in terms of our prison system, in terms of the severity of the sentences that we impose. And the other thing that the story you told us about, how arbitrary it seems like, she says, I'm not feeling it. And she's like, maybe I'll feel it. Oh, all right, fine. Let's do it. It's so incredibly arbitrary, but it's also quite political, right? I mean, for those of us at a certain age, we'll never forget what happened with Michael Dukakis and the Willie Horton ads that George Bush ran. And obviously, and to be clear, that wasn't parole, it was a furlough program, but it's similar.
Yeah, it was the whole feeling of release. And actually, when Willie Horton's happens in 86, 87, the ad, parole rates drop because it's really any idea of freeing someone. This is so dangerous. And you're right, like there's a fear of what happens, this danger of like, well, what if somebody gets out, and they commit another crime? The solution of that is not to say, well, let's not let anybody out.
No, right. I mean, it can't be. That can't be the solution.
Which is sort of the solution that, the country has come to.
Right.
To say, like, we're fearful of these exceptional cases. I mean, one of the terrible things about American justice is that we let the exceptions become the rule and to create law. And that's sort of like how we operate in terms of fear, and the sort of politicizing of fear, really. These exceptional things, the most exceptional. It's like someone would respond if a caller was calling in, they'd say, what about a serial killer? That's always like the first thing. And that's like, yeah, what about him? That's like the most exceptional case. And like, how can that be the thing that's going to govern, what we're talking about, the majority of folks?
Right. And I mean, what people don't like even about going back to the Willie Horton thing, he was released in a furlough program
Yeah.
where 99% of the people who participated in that program were successful.
It was a total success.
So it's just kind of shocking
Yeah.
how impactful that story was.
I mean, furlough programs in other countries, probably have the same statistics, and they work because they're returning people to useful citizenship, and it's giving the purpose to what's going on.
Absolutely. And the other thing that's really interesting, we were just talking about remorse and presenting remorse to the parole board. But Johnny Veal, he was in a really tough situation because he had a compelling claim of actual factual innocence. And if the parole board is looking for remorse and you're saying, I didn't do it, well, that's a real clash of interests. I'm particularly interested in this part of the story because one of my areas of research, as you mentioned, is wrongful convictions. And here's a scenario where someone is claiming innocence to the parole board. People love to think, oh, the system works to exonerate people, but it really doesn't. We know a lot of innocent people sort of get stuck in prison because the legal system isn't working, and parole can sometimes be their only mechanism for release. And so there's this tension. Do they say, I did this thing, even if they didn't, and maybe mess up their future innocence claim just to get out? Or do they maintain their innocence and risk getting denied parole?
Yeah. What happens when you feel like you can't say, I'm sorry? What happens when you can't say, I'm repentant about the crime because you insist you didn't do it? If like the greatest commodity that you have is to show how remorseful you are. And so what happens when people say, like, listen, I didn't do it, two things happen that work against them. One is that the board members are like, this person isn't taking accountability for their actions, even however many years later. And in Johnny Veal's case, it was like literally 50 years later, a half century, 51 years by his last hearing. And to say, like, how could this person not take responsibility after all this time? And the other thing, which, I've talked about before, is that the danger in most of these hearings is to return to the original crime and like all these details, which are like ancient history. And once you start talking about innocence, you're sort of stuck in the past because you're debating like, well, what happened? And here's a body that doesn't have investigators, doesn't call witnesses, and they're suddenly like having these debates, based on basically like what's passed down to them by police and prosecutors, from the Nixon era. And they're like, going over details of like, well, where was that fired from? And like, where was that building? And like, those buildings aren't even there anymore. So they get stuck in the past and they're not thinking any more about like, well, who is the person today? And so, yeah, it's a total paradox. If you say you're innocent, you're kind of stuck. almost everyone who assists that they're innocent is told by a lawyer and by people in prison who look out for them to say, you know what, just say you did it. Please just say you'll have a better chance. Say you did it and say how apologetic you are, how terrible you feel. You'll have a much better shot at getting out. For some people, they do say that and they do get out. Those are examples. And then there are other people that say, you know what, like I never could say that. And Johnny Veal Khalif was one of those people. I can't say I did something that I didn't do. I can't have people think I'm this murderer of these killing these two cops. I just didn't do that. And so he refused to do it. His lawyer said, please do it. I went to his hearings. The board member who interviewed him said, why don't you just tell me something I want to hear? That's a language. He said, why don't you just tell me something I want to hear? He actually infantilized him. He said, when a child puts their hand in a cookie jar and takes a cookie, they like to say they didn't do it. And, why don't you tell me what really happened? And so he's like, this didn't happen. So it's a huge problem. But occasionally, the board members either like see that there's enough evidence of, that a case might not be, beyond a reasonable doubt, like, or they're able to look beyond that question of guilt or innocence and say, like, listen, what about the amount of time? What about the person's record in prison? What about who they are today? Occasionally, but it does, as you say, it makes it much, much harder.
So we won't reveal what Johnny did wind up saying to the parole board, but it's a really compelling part of the book. And, staying with Johnny Veal's situation, so not only is he saying, I'm innocent, but he's accused of, and he's actually convicted of murdering two police officers.
Yeah.
The role of victims and victims' rights actually came up a lot in Johnny Veal's parole process. Every time there was a parole hearing, the police would show up, in masse every single time that Khalif came up for parole. These police officers would stand up and say they were representing the Severin family, one of the victims who was shot at the Cabrini housing projects. So can you talk a little bit about the impact that these victim representatives had on the parole process?
Jessica, to paint that picture a little more, if you're a board member and you're looking out at the visitors, that then they when it's a police case, a case of somebody convicted of murdering a police officer, they usually have to change venues to a bigger place. And you'll get like, 20, 30, 40 cops who come from the district where the crime occurred. They come in uniform, service revolvers on their hips. They stand up and introduce themselves. And, I'm here to oppose the release of Johnny Veal. I'm Sergeant so-and-so. I'm here to oppose. It's powerful. It's really powerful. Police will even say, like a fallen officer is never forgotten. It's like a display of that. And there's a sense of like, and if you release this person, that won't be forgotten either. There's going to be a cost. Victims should, they need to be represented in the justice process, of course. Their role at parole hearings can be really problematic. I mean, those police officers are not the victims exactly. They're like representing a kind, they feel like a family, whatever, in some sense, of police officers, blue, brothers in blue. But again, like how arbitrary these hearings can be, whether a victim's family member shows up on one day or not could also change the outcome, is also just a kind of how precarious justice is. One of the things that, people often ask me, like, what surprised you in the book? And diving into the victims' rights movement really did. And, sort of the long chapter about victims' rights, which is part of what you're talking about, and not just at parole hearings, but in general. And for many years, people victimized by crimes felt victimized again by the justice system, especially, say, women. This is how victims' rights start. Women who are victims of rape or domestic abuse would try to report their crimes and feel not heard, or there'd be, having to recount the tales would be painful. They didn't feel safe. And so building out of this, like a much more robust rights for people who are victims of crimes occurs, but it becomes politicized pretty fast. And this is in the 70s, and then by the 80s, there's sort of these larger victims groups, things like Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. They become advocates with a lot of power. They're interested not just in supporting their fellows, people who are trying to deal with like the most painful things that could ever happen in life, But on the flip side, to make sure that crimes are punished longer and more definite, and not just for the people who are specifically, that they're offenders, but in general. And for Republicans, conservatives, this becomes this great cudgel that they can use. And what could be more powerful than a mother whose child was killed, and to change laws? It becomes political also in the sense that it doesn't see clearly the victims of crimes or necessarily support them. Almost the vast majority of crimes in this country are within races, meaning like white people commit crimes against white people and so on. I'm in Chicago. 85% of crime victims, of homicide victims, are Black. And the victims' rights movement is much more focused on a kind of idea of like a white suburban person and their sense of fear. And so laws are created around that are supporting them in some way. And like, but the people who are suffering from it are in these communities, which are actually the vast majority of victims exist. This is part of our mainstream culture now. It's so much a part of a culture that you don't see it because it's everywhere. It's like in our pop culture, in our movies, everything. But that this is a really like to see that creation, over a couple decades in the 80s and early 90s was powerful and sort of seeps into parole hearings, of course. Like then part of the victims' rights movement is they get the ability to speak at parole hearings that didn't exist before necessarily. And you hear these testimonies, and of course they're powerful, but a family member of somebody who was murdered in 1970, they might still be suffering, but they are in some way the least qualified, and I mean this with all sensitivity, to know what's happened to somebody who committed that crime, what's happened over the years. They've never visited them. They've never spoken to them. What they know is still the pain and suffering they feel from that moment. And so they don't have any new information. It's why, like at a trial, they wouldn't be allowed to serve on a jury. You can't have perspective. Those testimonies are incredibly powerful and painful. I remember talking to this police officer, a Chicago cop whose father was killed in the 1970s. And he was saying that, 50 years later, he still wanted to kill the guy. And he talked actually about a moment when he was on duty and he had to take somebody to prison as part of his responsibilities. And while he was there, he saw one of the men who was convicted of killing his father, 45 years earlier. And he quickly calculated, like, okay, how can I strangle him to death? So there's a slick floor here. Let me take my shoes and socks off real quickly so I can like get him in a grip before they can get me off him and I won't slip and slide. And then he didn't do it, but he made that calculation. And it made me think just like how much the justice system fails people like him, fails the victims of crime. Like you're told that the only recourse, the only thing you have is to press this button that says more punishment. And even 50 years later, you don't feel any change. Like it's such clear evidence